Hey folks. I don't know if I've ever told this story in full, but it's been eating at me for years. It's one of those things you experience, and you can't ever quite shake it off, like a shadow that follows you, no matter where you go. I was 22 at the time, full of ambition and raw excitement, thinking this expedition would be the adventure of a lifetime. But looking back, I realize how unprepared I really was for what we were about to face. This all started in the early 2000s. I was fresh out of college, barely scraping by with whatever odd jobs I could find, when I got a call that would change everything. An opportunity to join an expedition to find a lost city deep in the South American jungle. The city of Xibalba, one of those whispered legends, a myth that ancient civilizations had kept hidden. I couldn't pass it up, so I packed my things, said goodbye to my family, and set off. The team? Well, they were real professionals, at least, that's how I saw them at first. But, looking back, they were just as lost as I was. There was Dr. Thomas Avery, the leader of the expedition. Avery was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, but with a weathered face that had seen more than a few decades of hard living. He wore the same battered leather jacket every day, the kind that made him look like a man who could lead an army, if he had one. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind of voice that demanded attention, and damn near everyone jumped when he spoke. But there was a coldness in his eyes, like he was more interested in proving something to himself than leading the team. Rachel, the archaeologist, was my age but had years of experience under her belt. Early 30s, but sharp. The kind of woman who could look at a pile of rocks and see history in every fracture. She had a sarcastic edge to her, often rolling her eyes whenever Avery made one of his grand speeches about the mission. I swear, she could pick apart any theory you threw at her with a single sentence. She wasn't interested in adventure for the thrill, it was all about the science for her. And that meant she didn't suffer fools. Not that any of us were fooling around, but it was clear she didn't have much patience for us. Then there was Peter, the geologist. I couldn't tell you much about him, he was that quiet. He had this aura of calculation around him, like everything he said was carefully measured before it left his lips. Peter was in his mid-40s, with graying hair at the temples, always wearing the same tired old hiking boots and khaki pants. He had this knack for looking at things like stones and dirt, saying stuff like, "This will hold, this won't," and being right every damn time. He didn't care for small talk, so the few times I tried to chat with him, it was like pulling teeth. But he knew his stuff, and that mattered. Then there was me. The kid, at least, that's how they treated me. I had big dreams, but no real experience. I was just eager to prove myself, thinking this trip would make me one of them, one of the seasoned pros. I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself, something that mattered. I thought maybe if I showed them I was useful, they'd take me seriously. But I quickly realized that being the youngest wasn't an asset out here. It made me an outsider, something that came into sharper focus once we entered the jungle. We started the trip with so much energy. The air was thick with humidity when we landed in the nearest city, the kind of damp that clung to your skin like a second layer. We were all dripping with sweat by the time we made it to the small outpost where we'd meet our local guides. The city itself had an eerie quiet to it, bustling enough, but you could tell the locals were used to foreigners coming and going. They looked at us like we were just another group of rich adventurers wasting their time on some long-shot quest. The guides? They didn't trust us. I could feel it in the way they stared at us. Older men, with faces weathered by the jungle, their eyes narrow with suspicion. They spoke in rapid Spanish to each other, clearly not happy about having to guide a bunch of gringos into the heart of the unknown. But we were paying them, so they did their job. I remember one of them, Carlos, his voice thick with a heavy accent, warning us about the jungle like it was some kind of living thing that would eat us alive if we weren't careful. Still, the first few days felt like an adventure. The jungle was alive in ways I'd never imagined, alive in a way that made everything feel louder, more urgent. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on us like a weight, but it was the sounds that were overwhelming. Birds squawking, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a branch that made you jump out of your skin. We pushed forward, hacking our way through dense undergrowth, following a map that felt more like a guess than a plan. Every night, the air would grow thick with mist, and the trees above us seemed to form this dense canopy that blocked out the stars. I remember feeling this weird mix of awe and dread. We were walking into the unknown, and I couldn't help but think we were being watched. The jungle was alive, alright, but it also felt like there was something else out there, something older than us. Something waiting. By the time we reached the jungle's heart, I could barely tell where the jungle ended and we began. The thick undergrowth swallowed us whole, the trees towering above like ancient guardians, their trunks twisted and covered in moss. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing underwater. Every step we took seemed to sink us deeper into the green abyss, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being dragged into something we couldn't control. The argument started soon after. Dr. Avery, being the expert he was, kept pushing us forward, insisting we follow his map, his route, despite the fact that we'd run into nothing that matched any of the landmarks he had promised. Rachel was the first to speak up, frustration clear in her voice. "This map's a joke, Tom. You're leading us into a swamp, and I swear if we keep going this way, we'll be stuck in quicksand by morning." Avery shot her a look, sharp enough to cut through steel. "If you're going to question every decision I make, Rachel, maybe you should turn back now." I could feel the tension in the air, thick, palpable. I was caught between the two of them, unsure of who to agree with. On one hand, Avery had led expeditions before, and his confidence felt reassuring. But on the other, Rachel's logic made sense. We weren't making any progress, and the farther we went, the harder it was to breathe. I remember looking at Peter for guidance, but he was just silently observing, his face unreadable. I never knew if he had an opinion or if he just didn't care. It was hard to keep my mouth shut. I wanted to say something, to show them I was more than just the rookie on the team, but the more I opened my mouth, the more it seemed like they just ignored me. I was barely a footnote in their ongoing battle for control. Days turned into a blur of sweat, exhaustion, and constant fighting with the jungle. We ran out of food faster than expected, the supplies we'd packed becoming increasingly useless. Avery insisted we ration, though I could tell he was starting to crack under the pressure. He stopped leading us with the same vigor, often disappearing into the back of the group, leaving Rachel to take charge of the route. "I told you we should have brought more water," Rachel snapped one night, her voice bitter as she examined the last of our bottles. We were sitting around the campfire, the flickering light throwing shadows across our faces, the sound of distant howler monkeys echoing through the trees. Peter didn't respond. He never did. He just stared into the fire, his hands cradling his last bottle of water, the liquid barely enough to wet his lips. There was something unsettling about him in moments like this, like he was preparing for something worse, as if he knew this wouldn't end well. I think the worst part about all of this wasn't the hunger, or the heat, or even the creeping fear of the jungle swallowing us whole, it was that I could sense the shift in the group. We weren't just an expedition anymore. We were survivors. And then, on the fourth night, everything changed. We had arrived at the edge of a large clearing. The kind of clearing you only find in places that haven't seen human feet for centuries. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in a thick blanket of moss, and in the middle of the clearing stood these enormous stone structures, half buried, but clearly man-made. They were covered in strange carvings, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as the firelight flickered over them. None of us had the energy to explore them in detail, so we set up camp at the edge, hoping the night would bring some kind of clarity. But I couldn't sleep. There was something about the air in that clearing. Something wrong. I don't know how long I lay there staring into the dark, listening to the distant calls of jungle creatures, but when I finally dared to sit up and look around, that's when I saw it. Movement. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again, a figure moving between the ruins, cloaked in shadows. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was one of the locals, or something else. But I wasn't about to wake the others. What if I was wrong? What if it was just the wind? But no. There was something, someone, out there, moving deliberately, purposefully. I wasn't sure what to do. I grabbed my gear and crept closer, my boots sinking into the soft ground as I made my way toward the ruins. That's when I saw them, figures, dozens of them, gathered around a large stone altar. Their movements were slow and ritualistic, like they were performing some kind of ceremony. They wore tattered robes, their faces hidden by long hoods. I could hear their murmurs, low and unintelligible. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the sight of them that terrified me, it was the feeling. Something about them felt wrong. I was about to turn back when one of them turned and saw me. The moment their eyes met mine, the air seemed to freeze. I don't know how, but they immediately began running toward us, their feet moving like they had all the energy in the world, despite the late hour. I barely had time to scream for the others before Rachel, Peter, and Avery shot to their feet, staring at the figures charging toward us. "Run! Get to the camp, now!" Avery yelled, his voice cracking with something between panic and command. We scattered, running for our lives through the dense undergrowth, hearing the rustling behind us, louder with every passing second. It felt like the jungle itself was pushing against us, the thorns and branches tearing at our clothes, the ground beneath our feet sinking and shifting like it wanted to swallow us whole. We didn't stop until we reached the camp, breathless and terrified, the distant sound of footsteps echoing in our ears. And that night, we didn't sleep. That night was the longest of my life. The jungle was alive with sound, far too alive. The usual noises, the chirping of insects, the distant growl of a jaguar, were swallowed by the rustling of branches, the snapping of twigs, the heavy breathing of something lurking just beyond our camp. We huddled together, our eyes darting around in the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Avery paced in tight circles, his face pale, his hand rubbing at his forehead like he could wipe away the terror he'd just seen. Rachel sat on a fallen log, arms crossed tightly against her chest, her sharp eyes scanning the perimeter as if she could see things we couldn't. Peter didn't say a word. His face was unreadable as ever, but I noticed his hands were shaking, just slightly, but enough to catch my attention. None of us spoke about the figures we'd seen, but the silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. We knew what had happened. Those people, those things, had seen us. They had been watching us, and when they realized they were discovered, they came for us. Avery's voice broke the silence, low and gravelly. "We're not safe here. We need to move." Rachel immediately shot up, her eyes narrowing. "Where do you propose we go, Avery? We're in the middle of the jungle. We can barely navigate during the day, and now you want to go wandering at night? We don't have a choice. We have to get out of here," Avery insisted, his voice trembling in a way that made me question if he knew something we didn't. Peter didn't speak, but he stood up slowly, looking at the ground, as if he were deep in thought. I couldn't tell if he agreed with Avery or was just too tired to argue anymore. But his silence spoke volumes. We all knew we were on the edge of something dangerous. The atmosphere had shifted. The jungle felt alive in a way that was almost watchful, like it wasn't just the ruins or the people that could hurt us. Rachel seemed to relent, shaking her head as if to say she was done fighting. "Fine. But we don't have any more water, and we've barely got enough food to last another day. If we leave now, we might just end up wandering in circles." But there was no real argument anymore. Avery was determined, and we were too scared to stay where we were. So, we packed up as quietly as possible, though every movement felt like an announcement to whatever was watching us. We moved out at first light, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting the jungle in a cold, gray light. I could feel the weight of the silence around us, the air thick with anticipation. We were walking deeper into the unknown now, farther from any sense of civilization. The jungle had swallowed us whole, and we had no idea where we were going anymore. Every direction looked the same, dense trees, endless vines, and a canopy so thick that even daylight couldn't break through. As we trudged through the mud, pushing past tangled vines and overgrown plants, I noticed that the jungle itself seemed to change. The trees became taller, their bark slick with moisture, the undergrowth more oppressive, more twisted. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating. But the worst part was the stillness. It was like the jungle had gone silent, no birds, no insects, no sounds of animals moving. We had been walking for hours when we came across the first of the signs that we were not alone. At first, it was just a faint trail, a line of footprints in the wet earth. Human footprints, but too large to belong to any of us. They were bare, but the toes were strangely long, almost inhuman. Avery crouched down to study them, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What the hell?" he muttered, tracing the footprints with his finger. "These aren't our guides. These aren't even people." Rachel stepped forward, squinting at the tracks. "Avery, those don't look human to me. They look wrong." It wasn't just the size that bothered me, it was the way they didn't make sense. The tracks weren't moving in any pattern we could follow. They twisted and turned erratically, as if the person, or thing, had been walking in circles or had no real purpose. But what disturbed me the most was the faint, lingering smell that seemed to hang in the air. It was a rotten, decaying odor, like the jungle itself had begun to rot. I couldn't place it, but I could feel it clawing at the back of my throat. Avery stood up abruptly, his eyes darting around. "We're being followed," he said, his voice tight. "They know we're here." Rachel swore under her breath. "Great. That's just perfect." We kept moving, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Every rustle in the undergrowth made our hearts race. Every snap of a twig felt like an omen. But nothing could prepare us for what came next. As we ventured further into the jungle, we began to lose our bearings. The map, what little we had of it, was useless now. It was like the jungle itself was shifting, changing, pushing us deeper into its heart. It felt like we were lost, in every sense of the word, and the harder we tried to make sense of our surroundings, the more they began to feel wrong. Then, as the sun began to set, casting everything in that eerie orange glow, we saw it, the city. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought I was imagining things, that maybe the jungle was playing tricks on me. But as we approached, I saw the outlines of stone structures emerging from the thick foliage. Massive stone walls, covered in centuries of vines and moss. Arched doorways. It was a city, the city, but it was ruins, decayed and forgotten by time. We stood there for a moment, frozen. This was it. The lost city of Xibalba. But something about it felt off. It wasn't the grand, ancient city we had imagined. It was abandoned, silent, and dark, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for us. We weren't alone in the city. We stood at the edge of the lost city, our breath caught in our throats. The ruins loomed before us, silent, like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. The massive stone walls were covered in a blanket of vines and moss, so thick that they almost appeared alive, pulsing with the movement of the jungle. The air here felt different, as if the very ground was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't believe it. This was the place we'd been searching for, but it was nothing like we'd imagined. There was no grand entrance, no gleaming temples like the ones you see in movies. This was just ruins, broken and forgotten, swallowed whole by the jungle. And yet, there was something about it. It was alive in a way I couldn't explain. "Yes," Avery said, his voice strained but steady, though I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. "This is it. We've found it." Rachel stepped forward, her sharp gaze scanning the structures with a mixture of fascination and wariness. "It's older than I thought. This isn't just an abandoned city, it's been hidden for centuries. The architecture is like nothing I've ever seen before." Peter didn't say a word. He was looking at the ground, his face drawn, his eyes haunted. He'd been getting quieter as the days went on, but now his silence was oppressive. I could feel his discomfort radiating from him, like he knew something we didn't. We pushed forward, the city's ancient stones creaking underfoot as we made our way deeper into the heart of the ruins. The air grew heavier, the humidity thickening with every step. There was an overwhelming sense of foreboding that settled over us like a blanket, pressing down on us until it was almost too much to bear. We passed through arched doorways, the stone chiseled with intricate symbols and carvings, too worn and weathered to make out. The place felt like it had been abandoned by more than just people, it felt like the land itself had turned its back on it. The jungle had reclaimed what had once been a bustling civilization, wrapping its tendrils around every structure, every stone, as if it were trying to erase all traces of the past. Then, as we entered a larger courtyard, we heard something. A low hum, a distant chant, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't the wind. It was too intentional. There were voices, chanting, low and rhythmic, echoing from the shadows. Avery held up his hand to stop us, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the courtyard. He motioned for us to stay quiet, but his expression was tight, like he was bracing himself for something. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." But it was too late. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. At first, I thought they were more members of the expedition, but as they stepped into the dim light, I realized how wrong I was. They were tall, dressed in robes made of what looked like animal hides, their faces hidden by strange, jagged masks. The masks were crude, with wide, staring eyes and twisted features that made my stomach churn. They moved like they were part of the jungle itself, slipping between the columns and walls, as if they belonged to the ruins. There were dozens of them, more than I could count, their chanting growing louder as they gathered in a circle in the center of the courtyard, facing a massive stone altar. The altar was covered in carvings, deep, twisted designs that seemed to move in the flickering shadows. I could hear Rachel's breath catch behind me. "This is a ritual. They're performing a ritual." I didn't need her to say it. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness, like we had stumbled into the middle of something ancient, something sacred, something we were never meant to see. The figures, these people, if they could even be called that, were swaying in time with the chant, their movements slow and deliberate. And then, it happened. One of them turned. Their eyes, wide and hollow, locked onto mine. For a moment, everything froze. The chanting stopped, the air went still, and I swear to God, time itself paused. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my body frozen in place. The figure, its head tilted slightly, like it was studying me, considering me, then stepped forward, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, the chant started again. Louder. Faster. They were moving toward us now, the circle broken, the air electric with anticipation. "Run!" Avery's voice shattered the silence, and before I could even process what was happening, we were turning and sprinting back the way we came, the sounds of the chanting growing louder, echoing behind us. I could hear them, the figures, moving faster now. Their footsteps were unnatural, almost inhuman, like they were gliding across the ground. I could feel the weight of their presence, they were coming for us. We bolted through the narrow passageways, trying to retrace our steps, but it was like the city was shifting around us. Every corner looked the same, every pathway a mirror image of the last. The stone walls seemed to close in on us, and the jungle outside felt miles away. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes? Hours? Time had no meaning anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting away. But no matter how fast we moved, the chanting never stopped. It followed us, an ever-present reminder that we were not alone. Finally, we stumbled into an open area, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. But there was no escape. We were trapped. The figures, the ritualists, had surrounded us, their eerie chanting now an unrelenting roar in our ears. Avery grabbed me by the shoulder, his face pale with fear. "We need to stay quiet," he hissed. "They'll pass us by. We just need to wait them out." I couldn't think. My mind was too clouded with fear, my body too exhausted. We pressed ourselves into the shadows, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but we were frozen. All I could hear was the chant, growing louder, louder. Closer. Then, from the edge of the courtyard, I saw something that made my stomach drop. One of the figures had noticed us. They were moving toward us, their head tilting in that unsettling way. Their eyes were locked on me once more. And they were coming faster. Panic surged through me as I watched the figure approach. Its head tilted again, its mask never blinking, never shifting, just those dark, hollow eyes staring into mine. A cold chill ran down my spine, and my breath came in shallow gasps. We were trapped. The chanting echoed louder, like an overwhelming tidal wave crashing over us. My heart thudded against my chest, a frantic, primal rhythm. I could feel the pressure building in my head, the weight of the air crushing me. The sound of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, made every fiber of my body scream to run, to escape. Avery grabbed me roughly by the arm, yanking me back into the shadows of the nearest crumbling wall. "Stay down. Don't move a muscle," he whispered urgently. I nodded, but the fear was rising in my throat, choking me. I could feel the presence of the figures all around us, their movements swift and eerie, like shadows chasing shadows. Their eyes scanned the ruins, their heads swiveling with unnatural precision. They were looking for us. And when they found us, it wouldn't end well. Rachel was already pulling out her knife, her face set in a grim expression. "We can't outrun them. We have to fight." "No," Avery hissed. "If we fight, we die here. We hide." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced me. We couldn't risk exposing ourselves. So, we stayed there, crouched behind the ancient stones, trying to be as quiet as possible. But I could hear them getting closer, their chanting vibrating through the ground like a drumbeat. They were moving in. They were closing in. The thought that they were so near made my skin crawl. I didn't dare look up, but I could feel their presence, as if the air itself was suffocating us. Time had stopped. Everything had stopped. There was only the sound of the chanting, the oppressive heat of the jungle, and the thumping of our hearts. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air. Peter's scream. I whipped around just in time to see him stumble out of the shadows, his face twisted in terror. He was running, his legs pumping furiously as he darted across the courtyard. But the figures, those eerie, silent people, were already moving toward him, their heads snapping toward him in unison. "Peter! No!" I screamed, but it was too late. In a blur, one of the figures lunged toward him, its hands outstretched, grabbing him by the shoulders with a grip like iron. Peter's body jerked, his legs kicking and thrashing as he struggled to break free. The figures didn't react. They didn't flinch or show any emotion. They just watched him, as if his struggle was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. The next few moments happened in a blur. Peter's screams were drowned out by the rising chant, a horrifying crescendo that seemed to shake the ground beneath us. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Peter was pulled into the shadows, his body vanishing from sight. We were frozen. There was no fight. No argument. No plan. We were running. Avery grabbed my hand, pulling me forward as Rachel took the lead. We sprinted blindly through the ruins, our feet pounding the uneven ground, the sound of the chanting now a constant roar in our ears. I could feel my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't dare stop. Every step was a step away from those masked figures, every breath a desperate plea for survival. The jungle outside was no sanctuary. As we broke through the last of the stone structures and emerged into the dense undergrowth, I realized we were no longer in control of where we were going. The jungle itself seemed to turn against us, the vines tangling around our legs, the trees shifting in ways that made it impossible to tell which way was which. "We're lost. We're lost!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw with fear. Avery gritted his teeth, pulling us through the thick brush, his eyes wild with panic. "Keep moving. We can't stop." But the jungle wasn't letting us go. The paths we tried to follow twisted back on themselves. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches blocking our way, guiding us deeper into a maze of darkness. Every turn felt wrong. Every direction was a dead end. And all the while, I could hear it. The chanting. The relentless, rising chant that seemed to be coming from every corner of the jungle. They were still following us. We weren't getting away. We were running straight into a nightmare. Hours passed, at least, I think it was hours. Time had no meaning in the thick, suffocating air of the jungle. We were soaked in sweat, our bodies cut and bruised from the harsh terrain. But no matter how hard we ran, no matter how fast we pushed ourselves, the figures never stopped. They were always just behind us. We could hear their footsteps in the distance, feel their presence pressing down on us, getting closer. As the night wore on, the sounds of the jungle began to fade. The usual calls of animals, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, everything fell silent. It was like the jungle had stopped breathing, holding its breath in time with the growing dread that clung to us. We finally collapsed in a small clearing, our bodies aching, our minds in a haze of exhaustion and fear. But even in the silence, I could feel them. The figures were out there, just beyond the tree line. We had nowhere to go. "We're not going to make it," Rachel muttered, her voice low and cracked. Avery didn't respond. He was staring out into the jungle, his eyes wide, as if waiting for something to happen. For someone to save us. But no one came. We huddled together in the dark, our bodies pressed close, trying to keep the cold at bay, listening to the distant sound of chanting. And we waited. We waited for something, anything, that could break the suffocating terror surrounding us. That we had been waiting in that godforsaken jungle for what felt like an eternity. The night stretched on with the weight of 1,000 years. The jungle around us had turned from an ominous ally to a suffocating prison, closing in on us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my blood run cold. Were they out there, watching us? The ritualists, those silent figures, lingering in the shadows, waiting for us to make a sound? I didn't know. I couldn't know. Rachel had her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes red and unfocused. She hadn't spoken much since Peter was dragged away, her silence heavier than any words. Avery, on the other hand, was pacing, his steps frantic, his face pale as the moonlight filtered through the thick canopy. His mind was clearly a whirlwind of thoughts, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We weren't going to survive this. We had barely enough strength left to keep moving, and the jungle seemed to be draining it from us with every passing second. We were lost. But worse, we were stuck. It felt like the land had swallowed us whole, like there was no way out, no hope, no help. Then, just as I thought my mind might fracture from the weight of it all, we heard it. A distant, familiar sound. Helicopter blades. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe the jungle had gotten to me, maybe the fear and exhaustion had finally cracked me. But no, the sound grew louder, and then we saw it, the faint silhouette of the rescue helicopter cutting through the thick canopy, the powerful rotors kicking up a wind that made the leaves dance. I didn't even realize I was running until I was already on my feet, shouting for help, my voice raw and desperate. "Over here. We're here. Help." Avery and Rachel scrambled behind me, their faces lighting up with something I couldn't quite place. Was it hope? Relief? Or was it just a desperate last grasp at survival? The helicopter finally broke through the trees, hovering just above us. The rescue team had found us. We weren't going to die here. We weren't going to become another forgotten tale of the jungle. But as we scrambled into the helicopter, breathing in the cold, sweet air, I glanced back one last time at the jungle. At the city. The lost city. The ruins of Xibalba. And I swear, I saw something. A figure. Or was it a shadow? It stood just beyond the trees, tall and still. Its mask was blank, staring at us with unblinking eyes. I couldn't be sure, but the feeling I had when I looked at it made my skin crawl. In that moment, I realized something. The city, Xibalba, was never meant to be found. It wasn't just hidden from the world. It was protected. It had been waiting, hidden in the depths of the jungle, for someone foolish enough to stumble upon it. And maybe, just maybe, it didn't want to be found. The rescue team took us back to civilization, and in the days that followed, I tried to piece together everything that had happened. But there were no records of the expedition. No photos. No journals. No maps. The footage we'd taken, the equipment we had used, everything was wiped from existence, as if we had never been there at all. The authorities said we were lucky. They said we had gotten lost in the jungle and that the search teams had done their best to find us. They didn't acknowledge what we had discovered. They didn't acknowledge what had happened to Peter. To the ritual. To Xibalba. They wrote it off as an expedition gone wrong, a mistake in the planning. I never spoke to Rachel or Avery again. We all went our separate ways, unable to cope with what we had seen, what we had survived. The city, the lost ruins, the strange people, everything was buried with us in the jungle. It was like it had never existed. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and I'm alone, I think I hear it again. That low, rhythmic chant. Echoing through the trees. And I wonder if Xibalba is still out there, still waiting, still hidden in the heart of the jungle, watching, guarding its secrets. Maybe one day, someone else will find it. Or maybe it will find them. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back.